Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for spending time with us today for part 3 of our Instant Insight series on biomaterials and medical devices. My name is Troy Nickel and I'll be your host today. I'm the product manager for our mechanical test products within TA Instruments. Our speaker today is Sadegh Behdad, who is an applications engineer here at TA and whom I have the pleasure of working with every day in our Minnesota facility. Sadegh has a PhD in material science and did a bachelor's and master's in polymer engineering. Prior to joining TA, Sadegh worked as a material scientist at Magic Leap. There, he supported material design and development teams on selecting material and where he tested various materials and components for virtual reality goggles and retinal projection devices. After Sadegh presents today, I'll relay the questions you submit via the Q&A tool in the lower left of your screen. So please feel free to send them in at any time through his presentation. Sadegh, thank you for presenting today. I'll now hand it over to you.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Troy. Welcome to another Instant Insight. So this is part 3 of a 4-part webinar series. There will be another lecture tomorrow by my colleague, Dr. Greg Kamiavsky, on rheology of soft biomaterials, and I encourage all participate in that. He's presenting very interesting examples. I'm going to talk about fatigue and durability of medical devices today. I'll start with a brief product overview. I'll try not to go too much into the details, but rather give a little context of what our instruments look like, how they operate, and then for the most of the presentation, I'll discuss application examples. You can think of these as case studies of how our users use their instruments to understand the fatigue life of their medical devices better. And I'll discuss a few examples in cardiovascular devices and an example on dental applications, and then we'll take your questions. So at TA Instruments, what we are really good at is basically measuring 4 physical properties: mass, temperature, force, and distance. And we combine those in various instruments to measure various material properties such as thermal, rheological, and in this case, mechanical properties of your devices and your materials. And in ElectroForce product line, more specifically, we have a series of various products, over 30 different products. And the first one that we are going to discuss in some of the slides today is our load frames. So basically, you are pulling and pushing on a sample, and you are measuring its response, sometimes even twisting. And we have various load frames from 22 newtons all the way up to 15,000 newtons. And that allows you to work on very soft materials such as tissue or tendons, and also on bigger and more rigid parts of the body like bones with these load frames. Use the same technology to have it on a more generic platform as what we call test benches. These are more flexible, use less lab space, and they allow you to position the motors and the sensors in various ways. So here's a few examples of how they look like. You can have biaxial testing, or you can have torsion and axial deformation together, either mounted vertically or horizontally. And we discussed the biodynamic products yesterday. These are the products that allow you to do mechanical simulation inside a bioreactor to study native or artificial tissue and generate the mechanical simulation on a live cell or a live tissue. This is the kind of work that is still in the research stage. And today, we're going to focus on cardiovascular devices. So over the years, in surveying our customers that make cardiovascular devices, we have found that they would prefer that we take some of this, the load in product development, off of their shoulders, So we have tailored the same technology that we use in load frames and test benches to do very specific tests really well in a reliable and proven manner. For example, we have devices that translate that axial deformation into a pulsatile deformation or volumetric displacement to apply uh, a a deformation on a stent and look at its contraction and expansion with your blood flow, or pressurize a heart valve, or look at the stents in your knees. And that is what you see in the instruments shown in this picture. And we will further discuss how each of these can help you understand your devices better. So the bread and butter of our technology is a linear motor technology. Here you can see pictures of the 3 different motors that we make. The concept is the same. You have a moving magnet that is attached to your crosshead, and you are controlling the movement of that magnet by applying by creating an electromagnetic field around it. And this moving magnet is attached to a flexural suspension system. This is a novel patented technology that allows us to very precisely control the movement of that magnet and generate a very high fidelity waveform. So here's a picture of the motor and how it looks. As you can see the flexures, these 2 steel belts at the top and the bottom of the motor are the parts of the flexural system, and you can see the moving magnet in the middle and the coils around it that control the movement. So this direct drive electromagnetics allows us to have very high accelerations because there's no bearings, and it is very precise because by controlling the current we can control the mechanical movement. It's very clean and quiet, and it has unmatched durability because of its frictionlessness. So we have a lot of these instruments placed in animal labs or even in clean rooms because of their quiet performance. And in medical devices specifically, the durability and the precision is what matters most. And we have a software that is customized for evaluation of the durability and fatigue testing of medical devices, and we'll discuss this further in the slides. So to summarize, the key technology benefits here are the responsiveness and precision and versatility of this technology. It's unmatched reliability because it's very durable and we offer the highest warranty in these motors, and it's very energy efficient and clean, so it minimizes the footprint of these devices. So here is a roadmap of the research and development in medical device manufacturing. So yesterday we were earlier on this map, so we were discussing characterization of native tissue or artificial tissue for these devices. Today we are further along the way. So we will discuss fatigue test of device materials, shape memory alloys to be more specific, device subcomponents, and then the complete device. And so to begin our discussion, there is a backdrop that I want to set before we jump into application examples. When you are looking at pushing your materials to a higher level, to use them for new applications or to improve their performance for an existing application, there's usually 2 regimes that you're going to look at, and I'm going to help you relate these 2. So on the left, you see what we call the static or quasi-static loading. It means that you are very slowly applying a deformation on your sample and looking at how it behaves until your sample breaks. So you'll plot the stress versus the strain in the beginning, you see an elastic regime where all of the deformation is recovered the moment you take off that load. Your sample goes back to its original stage. Then, as the stress level increases, you reach to a point that is called a yieldless stress. After that, there is always a portion of your deformation that is permanent damage. That is not going to be recovered, and we call that plastic deformation. So your material will increase in length until you reach to your ultimate tensile strength. That is the maximum force that your sample can take, and after that it breaks. So this will be the quasi-static. Now, we want to understand how it relates to a fluctuating loading situation, because to be honest, a lot of times we don't use materials in this way. We don't want them to be broken with one run or one application. So most of the time, we are studying their fatigue performance, meaning that we are applying a load that isn't necessarily as high as before, and we are not looking uh, at one load. So this is a cyclic load. So the load is increased up and down, and we are measuring the number of cycles that it takes to break that material. So the same areas that existed in the previous graph in quasi-static loading create three different regions in this new graph that shows the fatigue behavior. So region 1 would be between the yield strength and ultimate tensile strength. In this region, your material can take a few loads, but it's probably going to break really soon. So we call this the low cycle fatigue. So we are thinking like we are talking about, say, 100 cycles to 1,000 cycles. And then after that, as you reduce that stress, you go into uh, a linear region in this graph. Pay attention that this graph is a log-log graph, so linear is really exponential. So you reach to a region that when you're reducing that load, your material now survives a little longer, but not so long, and until you eventually reach to a load level below which your material does not fail during the course of your experiment. And that's how we show that data point in this graph. So you usually see a point with an arrow pointing to future in time, which is an indication that we know that this material is going to break at some point, but it wasn't within the number of cycles that we studied. We usually refer to that point as the endurance limit of your material. So some materials have it, some don't. Usually the materials like steel and titanium that are used inside your body are chosen to be those who have an endurance limit to ensure that they will survive for a high number of cycles to minimize the need for a replacement or another surgery. So looking to this again as a whole, uh, usually start with a quasi-static test to establish different regions of the fatigue loading regime or SN curve, which is a curve that shows us the various stress levels on the y-axis and the number of cycles that your material can take before it breaks at each of those stress levels. And that will be what we are looking for in each of these applications that we are going to discuss today. So our instruments are used in a lot of different applications. We have cardiovascular devices, orthopedic implants, dental implants, and other devices like breast implants or cardio meshes. Today, I'm going to highlight only two of those. We will have a few examples of cardiovascular devices and one example on dental implants. And like I said, because these are more in the later stages of the product development, in my slides, you will see a lot more standards, either ASTM or ISO standards, that provide guidelines for uh, researchers in this industry on how to evaluate the fatigue and durability of the components or the device as a whole. So the first example, we'll start with studying of the stent wire itself. The picture on the left is showing you a transcatheter heart valve replacement, or what is called as a TAVI. This is a new technology that is developed during the past 10 years. It allows you there's some sort of catheter mechanism that allows you to pull this heart valve in place without removing your old heart valve, your own natural heart valve, and sort of wedge it over that, and then the new replacement valve will perform instead of the old valve. So this allows you to have a minimally invasive surgery instead of an open heart surgery. A lot of times, shape memory alloys are used to make these stents, and we'll discuss why. But what is really interesting here in this example, this study is one of the landmarks that was done a few years back. And we are looking at two notions here. One is we are trying to test a sample under hyperphysiological conditions, meaning that we are testing the samples under conditions that you're pushing it above that what it will do in the actual conditions to induce a failure. So that's why it's called a fatigue to fracture or fatigue to failure. When we are discussing fatigue behavior of the material, there are two paradigms. One is fatigue to failure, meaning that you will test your material until it breaks, and the other would be fatigue to success, meaning that we only test to a number of cycles to show that this material can withstand that many number of cycles. Usually, the first one, the fatigue to failure, is used to establish design curves for the second one, for fatigue to success. And it's important to measure a statistically valid number of samples to do that. And we have an instrument, we call it a multi-specimen fatigue. It allows you to apply the same deformation to 16 samples simultaneously and then measure their behavior. So I'm going to ask my colleague Madison here to play a short video for you so you can better understand how it works. So what we are doing here is we are using a star-shaped accessory, attach it to our load frame to translate that deformation to 16 stations inside a bath at the same time. And you can test your samples either in compression or in tension. And on each of those stations, you have a load cell. So when your sample breaks, you can measure that load drop and know how many cycles it took to fail that sample. And because you have 16 data points, you can establish that statistically valid bounds that we talked about earlier, and I'm going to show in the next slide, to create a design curve. So here you are looking at load cells on each station. This independent measurement allows you to characterize failure points, and the bath is heated to make sure that you can maintain it at body temperature. And it comes with an autofill reservoir that if some of the water in the main container evaporates, it will refill it with the fluid that has the same temperature. I'm gonna stop this video here and then go back to the slide. So back to that study that I mentioned, we are looking at a stent surrogate here. Because these stents are complex structures, a lot of times you start with a repeating unit, a simpler structure to be able to understand it better and engineer it better. So here we are looking at one of those diamond-shaped repeating units, and we are testing them at 50 hertz to understand their fatigue life. And then later use that combined with FEA models to understand the whole stent behavior. So when we look at the findings of this study, there are two interesting findings. So the graph in the left is a classic ascending curve, just plotted a little differently. Usually you would have a stress versus number of cycles. Here we are looking at a strain versus number of cycles. In the stent space, that is normal, and a lot of times done because your body, your vessels experience a certain deformation, and then that creates a certain stress. So it's nothing different from what we saw earlier. What we see in this slide is that in the low cycle portion of the fatigue data, they were able to do a power law fit with a slope of minus 0.49. So this helps them create a model to understand the behavior in that region of the graph better. And then below 0.4% strain, the stent wires, the surrogate sample did not break. So this shows us that we have a certain strain that establishes a safety factor for designing these stents. And then on the right, you can see a second set of data that that is shown over the first set. So the first set was sort of bidirectional testing. You had zero mean strain and you were oscillating around that up and down. In the second set, we are applying a mean strain, a compressive mean strain, and then we are repeating the same. What is interesting is that we see that the behavior is not significantly different, and the endurance limit does not change, although we are applying a mean strain over the oscillation strain. Then the second conclusion was another way of looking at the same data. So here, what is shown is it's called a constant life diagram. So you are pulling and pushing these samples to a known number of cycles. Here is 10 million cycles. And the hollow dots show the samples that survive 10 million cycles. The solid squares show you the ones that broke. And your x-axis is your mean strain, and your y-axis is the oscillation strain that was exerted on the sample on top of that. So at each point, you have to add your x and y coordinates together to understand how much total strain was applied to that sample. So the dashed line shows you the endurance limit that we found before, 0.1% oscillation strain. What is interesting here is that as we go from left to right, meaning that we are increasing the initial pull, the mean strain that we applied to that surrogate, we see that a higher number of samples survive. And this is sort of counterintuitive because in the classic material design examples, usually when you pull a sample more, there's a higher chance that it breaks. But it seems that in this material, when you pull it more initially, that allows you to increase the durability of your stent wire. And that adds a whole new variable into your stent design. And the article stent design. And the article says that what they think is the source of this behavior is that the shape memory alloy can have a a solid state phase transformation between the two phases that are called austenite and martensite. And the martensitic phase has a better fatigue endurance. And they think that when you apply that mean strain to a higher level, you are inducing a phase transformation to the martensitic phase, and that is why it survives longer. So that is a good prelude to the second example that I'm going to present. And here we are studying the effect of thermal cycling on shape memory alloys. So basically, in a shape memory alloy, you have two phases. You have a high temperature phase or austenite, which has a simple cubic crystal structure, and you have a low temperature phase or martensite that has a monoclinic, more complex crystal structure. And the solid state phase transformation is reversible, and it is very close to room temperature, and you can engineer that to happen at various temperature by changing the dopants that you add to your nickel titanium or changing the portions of these components in the alloy. And if you start from room temperature, so in the little schematic that you see in the left, the hysteresis loop, if you start from room temperature and start heating up your sample, so follow the red line, you will have a temperature where your austenite starts to form, and then it takes a few degrees until this transformation is completed. And then as you cool it back down, you start to form the martensite phase again, and you will be fully martensite if you are cooled all the way down below that temperature. So looking at this graph, you can see that there is some hysteresis every time that you go through this cycle. And what we are trying to do by leveraging the standard is trying to determine how much residual strain there is for one run, one cycle of that, and what are these 4 thermal onset points. So MF, MS, and AS and AF, which are the start and the finish of formation of each of those two phases. The way the standard recommends to do this test is that first you will start here at the bottom at room temperature. You're not applying a load to your sample. You will just increase the temperature to your upper conditioning temperature. These temperatures are usually chosen to be 10 to 30 degrees farther from your transitions for better accuracy. And then you cool it down, and then you heat it up again. So heat, cool, heat. Now you apply a load. That's where you start recording data. You apply a load, and you can see that your sample experiences a strain because of that load. That's where you record your initial strain, or EI, and now I start to cool. As I start to cool, in the beginning, it behaves like any other material. So you see a linear decrease in length. Your sample is contracting as you're cooling it down until you reach to your starting point of your martensitic transformation. You're cooling your sample, but your sample is expanding because of that phase transformation, right? And then after it is completed, you start to see a normal behavior again, a linear decrease in dimension until you reach to your lower conditioning temperature. Now we are heating back up. We start heating back up. In the beginning, it's linear because it's just a normal material, no phase transformation, until we start to form austenite. Then you're increasing temperature. Instead of expanding, your sample length is decreasing now. And then we go back to your upper conditioning temperature, and we measure the final strain at ultimate as your upper conditioning temperature, and we look at the difference of the two as a residual strain. So we did this test using a DMA 3200. This is a high force DMA instrument. In this specific example, we are not using it for a DMA test. We're using it because of its oven and its ability to do higher temperature ramp rates. We were testing a rather thin wire, 0.3 millimeters in diameter and 20 millimeters of gauge length, overall length 35 millimeters. And we applied 10 newtons of load. We're testing this between 10 degrees C and 150 degrees C at a rate of 15 degrees C per minute. So a very fast experiment here. Here's what the data looks like. Let's just start on the left, looking at the three graphs that show you the changes in temperature, displacement, and load with time. So starting from the top, looking at the temperature changes with time. So this is a preconditioning. We go up, hold for a few minutes, go back down, cooling, and then we go up again. This is the first 2000 seconds of your experiment. So we are just preconditioning, no load. If you look at the third graph from the top showing load versus time, you see that there is zero load. Then we hold that temperature in the upper end at 150 C. And after we are sure that all of the sample is at the same temperature, we increase the load to 10 newtons. So a steep increase in load to 10 newtons. We are maintaining that 10 newton for the rest of the experiment. And then we start to cool a sample. So in the beginning, if you start looking at the displacement versus time, which is the middle plot, at around, say, 2800 seconds, you see that it starts to slowly decrease. So this is a contraction. Around 3000 seconds, that's where the Martin-Sadegh phase transformation starts. You see that the length is increased, so the displacement becomes more positive. So we are looking at almost 1 millimeter of displacement in a 20 millimeter long sample, about like say 4 to 5%. After the transition is completed, so we don't see any dramatic increase anymore. So we are reducing the temperatures and the sample dimensions are decreasing, and then we start heating up again. Going through that transformation, we see a similar significant and dramatic change in displacement, but in the reverse direction now, because we are doing the reverse of that phase transformation that we had before. So now, if you plot these data differently, this time we are plotting displacement versus time on the right, so or strain versus time. Now we can characterize the four corners of this graph to establish the onset temperatures for Martin-Sadegh and austenitic transformations, and we can measure the hysteresis, or we are looking at the transformation strain and the span. So basically looking at the width and length of that to help us understand how much actuation strain there is in the end. So then the next example that we are going to talk about is, now that we have tested the wire itself and the material, now we have the whole device, the complete heart valve. We are trying to look at another standard that helps us understand the behavior of and the fatigue life of the heart valve there. So this is ISO 5840, and there are two elements in this standard. First is we are trying to cover and measure the hydrodynamics of the heart valve, and the second is we are trying to understand the fatigue life and durability of it. And here are the two graphs that are used in this standard. They may look a little bit complex. If you are in the business of making heart valves, you are already familiar. If you're not, just bear with me for a second, and it will be a lot simpler than it looks like. So on the left, you are looking at flow versus time. So as your heart valve, as your heart ventricle starts to contract, how that affects the flow. So when your heart ventricle starts to is open, you have a flow, you have blood flowing through that. So your flow is going up until your heart starts to contract. So your ventricle, your heart valve is closed now, so the flow starts to drop until it's fully closed, So section 1 of that graph, it shows you the closing volume. That is totally normal and natural, because when the valve is closed, there's a draw on the valve, so that creates a closing volume behind the valves as they are closed. So that's normal. What is not normal and not desirable is the second part of that graph. So that is due to the leakage, or what we call the regurgitation of the blood. So this means that regurgitation of the blood. So this means that your valves don't close well. So when you're looking at the jargon that is discussed in understanding heart valves, so you hear the term stenosis sometimes, which means that the valves close shut, but they don't open really like a normal valve. Or you hear the term regurgitation, which means that you have a leaky valve. When you have a leaky valve, the supply of oxygen-rich blood to your body is reduced, and that can cause fatigue, no pun intended here, or you will feel out of breath. So that's why it's important to plot uh, flow versus time and pressure versus time to understand if our heart valve is doing what it is supposed to be doing. And uh, here we are looking at a higher number of cycles compared to uh, say knee implants or dental implants, because your heart is beating all the time. So we are looking at somewhere like 500 million cycles. And during those cycles, we are monitoring these two aspects. So the hydrodynamic aspect that is shown on the left, and the wear testing or durability testing that is shown on the right. So the graph on the right is showing you the same plot that we had before, shown in a dashed line. So line 3 is showing you flow versus time, and then you have two additional lines that show you the change in aortic pressure with time, shown in green. That's the top line, top solid line, and then the ventricular pressure shown in red. So the section that is shown inside that rectangular box is called the closing section, right? So what happens is, as your heart starts to contract, your ventricle starts to contract, you can see that, you follow the line number 2, you can see that your ventricular pressure is increasing and increasing with time until you reach to the left edge of that box. That is where your aortic pressure and ventricular pressure are equal, right? So your heart is still contracting, your ventricular pressure is increasing and increasing and increasing until your muscles, your heart muscles, start to relax. So it sort of plateaus and it drops a little bit, and on the left, on the right edge of that box, they're equal again. They're equal again, your muscles are relaxed, so the pressure is going to drop over time, and this uh, pressure differential between the aortic pressure and the ventricular pressure is what helps the valve close. So where you see that line that shows number 2 and that dramatic drop, that's where your heart valve is closing, because the aortic pressure is now more than ventricular pressure. And then there you have your closing volume causing a little dip, and then back to normal. So what's important here is that almost at all times, there's going to be, other than these two intersections, there's going to be a pressure differential between your aorta and your ventricle. And when the valve is closed, that pressure differential is creating a load on the valve. And you have to make sure that your valve can withstand that pressure for hundreds of millions of cycles. And that's what we are trying to establish here in the standard. So for a normotensive person, meaning a person who has a normal blood pressure, these pressure differentials are measured for both of the valves, both aortic valve and mitral valve. So it's 100 millimeters mercury for aortic valve and 120 for mitral valve. So the standard states that you are going to test your valve for 200 million cycles and then look at the pressure differential. There are three things that you are going to look at. You are going to make sure that that pressure differential is achieved. So your pressure differential should go above 100 or 120, and it is maintained for 5% of the time of each cycle. And you have to make sure that that happens for at least 95% of your test cycles. So this is the wear testing or fatigue testing. And every 50 million cycles, you have to stop the test, check out your valve to measure the hydrodynamic aspect of it. So you're looking at the appearance and you're looking at its leakage to see if it is affected after being exposed to fatigue. So here is the instrument that we have. We call it a heart valve tester to measure the heart valve fatigue. So you can have it with 2, 4, or 6 independent chambers, depending on the number of heart valves that you want to test at a time. And it gives you a plot like this. So this is basically what we discussed, just instrument results. So green and red are showing you the pressure in the distal and proximal chambers, which are representative of your aortic and ventricular pressure. And blue is just the differential of the two, right? Blue is what the standard is concerned about. So here is a zoom in of that pressure differential. The three things that we want to look at. We want to look at that the pressure is above, the delta pressure is above 100 millimeters mercury for 5% of each cycle. And the third aspect would be like several million of days over time. That you have to make sure that for at least 95% of those, you are maintaining that pressure differential. So I have a little video that I asked my colleague again to show you of how this instrument operates and how you mount your sample and all that. So here we are looking at a surgical heart valve. This is not a transcatheter, but the concept is the same. So you are looking at, this is a slowed down version of valve operation, and you can see how the three leaflets come together and close the valve, and the aortic pressure is more than ventricular pressure. So here you can, the valve is actually on our machine, so you can see that the ring is the retainer that holds your valve in place to allow you to test your heart valve. Thank you, Madison. And finally, the last example is going to be in a different application area. We are looking at the testing of dental implants. Here, the standard is a little bit different. Because if your dental implant fails, you're not going to die. So the severity of the standards is sort of proportional, relatively speaking, to the severity of the consequences if that device fails. And here we are testing to a lower number of cycles, of course, because you're not going to chew all the time. So you have an implant and abutment that goes on top of it, and then a crown that goes on top of both of those. And the standard says that here's how you're going to do it. So this is a good comeback to the first slide that we discussed on how you correlate the quasi-static behavior with cyclic fatigue behavior. It says pull a sample to measure its ultimate tensile strength. So break the sample to establish the static strength. Now start at 80% of that to create your fatigue graph, SN curve. Start at 80% of that maximum static force, test 3 samples, and then progressively lower that stress or force level until you get 3 samples that survive 5 million cycles. And then it says the stress ratio should be 0.1%, meaning that like when you're oscillating that load, the minimum load to maximum load ratio is going to be your minimum load is 1/10 of your maximum ratio. So looking at the instrument that we have, it's a 3310 load frame, so it's capable of applying 1,000 newtons of load. We have a dental implant fixture. What is important about this fixture is that if you look at it closely, you can see that the sample is mounted at an angle. It's standing at a 30-degree angle. And there's another video that Madison is going to play for you now, and we are going to look at it together. So if you look closely here, there are two important things that I want you to pay attention. One is we are basically creating a moment by pushing on that implant at an angle, and that creates some off-axis movement. So the accessory that you see on the top is designed so to prevent over-constraining that movement, because if we over-constrain that movement, we won't get that bending moment and we will only see axial deformation. So that's one thing that is important. And the second attribute would be looking at that in a second video. There is a zoom in of that first video that you will see here, and that shows you how the implant bends under that load, and you can see that there's some movement in the other direction too if you look very closely. So going to the results of this study, this is a study, by the way, done at IIT in India, and well, they didn't test because this wasn't done in academia, so they didn't have many samples in their hands, but they tested one sample for each point of their Asenkos. So if you want to comply with the standard, you got to test more. But the concept remains the same. So they tested 5 samples to failure, and the table on the left is showing you those 5 data points. They averaged those, and they measured that the average load to failure is going to be 308 newtons. Measured that the average load to failure is going to be 308 newtons. Then they took 80% of that, so that would be the first stress level that you're testing at on the right. So this is a load of around 240 newtons. They start there. They tested a couple of samples. The samples broke, so they lowered the stress level to another one. And you can see they start somewhere around 5,000 cycles, right? And then going from 80% to eventually 40% of the static failure load, you can see that they were able to reach to 5 million. So going from 5,000 cycles to 5 million cycles by, say, reducing the stress or load to a half of where you started, this shows you that this behavior is not really linear. So remember, in the initial graph that we discussed, the Bowler line looks linear, but it's a log-log plot. So it's actually an exponential improvement in fatigue life when you reduce the stress. And usually, so they found out that the 40% of the maximum static failure force is where you can get your endurance limit and sort of infinite fatigue life. And that's in consistency with other literature values. A lot of times, at least for pure materials, you'll see that your endurance limit is somewhere between 30 to 40 to 50% of your maximum static strength, and this is right in the middle of that. So going back to where we started, we know that research and development in biomedical devices is a long road. You start with characterization of the native tissue, and to understand it better for your devices, then you're going to test your device materials, then you're going to test device subcomponents, and then eventually you have to prove to regulatory bodies like FDA or CE that your completed device can deliver. And for each of those steps, we are with you, and over the years, we have proven that we have instruments that can help you understand your material's behavior better. And that brings me to my last slide. You see in this schematic that looking at various parts of the human body and the biomedical devices that go in there to help us have a longer life expectancy, how the instruments that we have can help you understand the mechanical behavior and fatigue life of those devices better to generate products that can help human beings live longer. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and open the floor to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadegh. That was excellent. Thanks for those explanations. You did a good job laying out multiple test methods on a couple different device types. Appreciate that. So I have a few questions for you if you're ready. You ready?
Ready.
All right. So the questions here are, let me take one here that says, can I change the loading level after my test started, or do I need to stop and restart it?
Yes, you can change the load level as your experiment is going on, because we know that when you want to create the sine curves, it's important to maintain the stress level for the whole duration. Your material is gonna, so as you're exposing this materials to stress, you start to generate micro cracks or small failure points inside them before they eventually break. So you see a decrease in the stiffness with time. So we have what we call a software feature, which is called waveform compensation, and it's looking at the loads that you have, and if your peaks and your valleys in your sinusoidal load or whichever load waveform that you are applying to your sample changes, it compensates by increasing that to a certain percent and making sure that you achieve the levels that you requested. This is on top of the normal controls that we have. So your controller will always try to maintain that load level that you requested. This is like a secondary auxiliary tool that if that first one doesn't work, so it's sort of belts and suspenders, help you maintain that stress level that you wanted to.
Okay, thanks. Another question sounds similar, but I think it's different. So if my stress levels change in real life conditions, how would I estimate the fatigue life? Would the SN curve still work? I think is the question there.
Yeah, so let me go back to this slide that we had in the beginning, where we correlated the two graphs together. Okay, so now if you look at this graph, you can see that at each stress level, you can draw a horizontal line and find its intersection with polar line, and then come back and read the number of cycles, right? The idea here, there is a rule called Miner's rule. The idea here is that your material can survive a certain number of cycles at any stress level. So you will calculate the cumulative number of cycles that it can take. So say at stress level 1, so which is the higher one, your material could survive N1 number of cycles, and you exposed it to small n, so that was capital N, small n, N1 number of cycles. So you are consuming, say, 30% of your material's life. Then you reduce the stress to stress level number 2, the green one here. At level 2, your material could survive capital N2 number of cycles. But now you had initially exposed it to a stress level, higher stress, and consumed 30% of its life. So now we are only going to consider the remaining 70%. So you can look at the summation of number of cycles exposed to number of cycles that it can take at each stress level. And the closer this overall summation gets to 1, the closer to failure you will be. So you are, this way you are looking at the cumulative durability of your material, and you can measure that from your sine curve this way. On the machine itself, we have what we call the block waveform, which allows you to have various waveforms. Say your material is experiencing, starts with a sinusoidal, then it is experiencing a triangular waveform. So meaning that the stress are now linearly changing up and down. Before that, it was sinusoidal. So you can create a combination of these and even apply conditional statement to those, saying, okay, if you are applying this load and you see that the material deformation is reduced now below a certain level, now stop doing what you were doing and go to the next step and do this. So that way you can create more complicated waveform to replicate what's actually happening in the human body. And actually, we are doing that in a lot of examples. Say, we have examples where people are looking at the effect of the human walking waveform on something. And we use the block waveform to create and replicate what's happening in natural conditions. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And we've had a lot of questions here. I'll try to just pick out a couple more, and then we'll just answer the rest via email and close out here. So here's a good question, touches a little bit on what you talked about before. If under fatigue compression tests, the sample height changes, how can I make sure the platens are in contact with the sample throughout the test?
So that's easy. So you're always looking at your load, right? So if your sample is touching the upper surface of your material, you will sense the compressive load. So if you exert and maintain a negative load at all times, no matter what the sample height is, you have ensured that you are staying in contact with your sample.
So this is under what we would call a force control method versus a displacement control method, right?
That's correct. Yes. So you can
So
tell your controller to apply deform two modes, either do it in a displacement control mode and look at these load changes, or you can control the load and monitor displacement changes. So yeah, in this case, doing a load control test will be more helpful because it is, regardless of the height of your sample, you can make sure that you stay in contact.
okay, good. One last question, which is actually two questions I'll put together, going back to the Pelton study on stent wire fatigue. You mentioned it was a 50 hertz test. So one question is why 50 hertz? And then a second related question is, well, how does frequency of the test impact the results, and how do you choose an appropriate frequency? And I can help with this answer if you're not sure, but you go first.
Okay. Either. So there are two aspects that help dictate that frequency. One element that we discussed is that a lot of times we try to push these to hyperphysiological conditions. And the other aspect is that we are trying to make products and test them faster than as fast as we can to help more people. If we were to test, wait 10 years to see how a specific design or a specific material works, that's equal to a lot of lives lost during the time that we spent on product development. So being able to do the tests at higher frequencies will help you uh, design and manufacture medical devices faster. So that's one aspect of it. And of course, that depends on your material type. In shape memory alloys, the good thing is you don't generate a lot of heat, even if you take it to higher frequencies. So that gives you an additional freedom in testing those. And that is where we actually stand out, because we are, because of our direct drive motor design, we are very good at delivering higher displacements at high frequencies, and that helps you test these materials, push it further in the frequency domain to get results fast.
No, that's pretty much what I was going to
Yeah, I'll
say. I
let you
think
complement that answer if you
assessing
have any points.
whether your material is viscoelastic is an important area. If it is viscoelastic, then that adds to the importance of assessing the fatigue performance at different frequencies. So you might do a mini study to understand how the fatigue performance would change from 20 to 40 to 60 hertz, let's say. Certainly in stent fatigue and stainless steel and nitinol, there's a lot of predicate data out there in the 60 hertz range, so that tends to be the limit, but we see people pushing that higher and doing some validation. Obviously, you have to prove that out and make sure that's right when you submit to the FDA. So just in general, I think the range is somewhere between 20 and 100 hertz, and you have to assess whether your material is significantly dependent on that frequency, and if so, do a good study and prove to the FDA that it's relevant and applicable, the test that you do. Okay, so I think we are out of time. We're over an hour. Thank you for all of you hanging with us. Especially thank you, Sadegh, for your time, your good explanation through many of those case studies. So we'll close it up. We'll wrap it up. Thank you for all your attention. Thanks. Bye.
خب بودم تموم شد. نه اون موقع هنوز شروع نشده بود. ضبط کردم، حالا گوش بد ببینی خوب.
راحت اینو فیگر کردی؟
اونو آره، این خیلی استریت فوروارد بود. یه چیزی که چیز بود، چون من یه عالمه میکروفون و فلان داشتم.